Yesterday we looked at what were the 4 of the worst hero talents released by Blizzard this week. Now we are moving in the middle ground. Now we are moving in the middle 4, the ones that are more or less all somewhat positive, at least for one of the 2 specs touched by the hero talents, or best case scenario, it's a good thing for both. They are not quite the best, perhaps they still miss something, or they lack some of the things that might make it much better, like the theme of the hero talents, or perhaps just making the talents themselves interesting. And what we have to start with is Hellcaller, which is the cross, the hybrid between Destro and Affliction. You know, there was some disappointment in the cross between Destruction and Demo because it was really heavily pet based. It felt like it was a demo 3 with Destruction kind of tacked onto it. Now, what's weird about Hellcaller is that it's basically now in reverse for Affliction. It does feel like it's an Affliction 3 with some random Destro attachment to it. As a side note, it's like they remembered last minute this was also supposed to be for Destruction. So the generic idea of the 3 is that you replace Corruption or Immolate with Wither, which is also an instant cast spell, which is a dot, and you have multiple ways to make this dot get more stacks, do more damage with more stacks, do more damage when the enemy is at low HP, do more damage the more damage you deal to the target, more talents to do even more damage. You have some basic passive effects like the more crit chance and the more basic damage. Some cool ideas in here. This is a pretty cool idea for Mythic Plus, Hate Fury Rituals, being able to shorten the dot by 50% to make it do double damage. It's a cool idea because one of the crucial weaknesses of dot specs in Mythic Plus is of course the time required for the dots to get rolling, so making dots half as long but doing twice as much damage can be a positive thing in Mythic Plus. I might have been playing a bit too much last epoch because when I read this it immediately reminded me of something already existing in a completely different game, which works basically exactly the same, and you even get an actual cooldown, Malevolence, to benefit off of all of the talents you have taken previously. The 10% haste is always going to be nice. What some players might have found a bit disappointing is the mention in Affliction about buffing Malefic Rapture to grant 1 additional stack of Wither, as the confirmation that Affliction in the War Within expansion is still planned to play around Malefic Rapture, which is somewhat of a depressing take for many Affliction warlocks. Now the main reason while this hero talent moves into the average to good category and not one of the worst ones, the feeling and the theme is already pretty good, but as we mentioned, it's mostly Affliction themed, more so than Destruction themed. The real thing though is this idea of a talent for Mythic Plus, Aura of Enfeeblement. Enemies within 10 yards are affected by your curses of weakness and tongues at 75% effectiveness. This is a very powerful tool in Mythic Plus to auto-spread these auras to multiple enemies at once. It's very, very powerful for Mythic Plus trash pools, effectively reducing by a lot for example, melee auto-attack damage taken by your tank, which is roughly 80% of the damage a tank is going to take in a Mythic Plus key. And this is getting reduced by quite a lot just by having a warlock with this talent existing in your Mythic Plus key. Obviously there will be room for tuning, and it's not that exciting to know you have a strong hero talent because you might be buffing tanks in Mythic Plus, but it is still a very powerful utility tool given to warlock with this set of talents. After Warlock, we have one of the 2 DK hero talents being revealed. This one is for Blood and Frost Death Knight, which plays around Reaper's Mark. You put the mark on the target, the more damage you deal to that target, the more stacks they gain. Once they reach 40 stacks, the mark explodes, dealing damage based on the amount of stacks. On top of that, the mark itself is going to travel to an unmarked enemy if the target dies or if you get the mark to explode. It does have some cool extra things like Reaper's Mark unleashing a dark wave towards your target and then coming back as a guaranteed crit. You also have Reaper's Mark's explosion causing a piece of the target's soul to tear out and spiral outwards to deal part of the damage as AoE, splash damage. You have the option to reduce the cooldown of this ability by 50% or to make this ability reapply on the same target when it ends, essentially making it last twice as long and making it repeat the explosion a second time. It does have a pretty satisfying loop, a pretty satisfying feedback loop that we have talked about before a few times. The cycle that makes many rotations feel good, the anticipation, the build-up towards what you want to get to. In this case is the explosion of the mark, and then you get to actually get the mark to explode, and you get to feel good because it was a lot of damage. It's a good cycle in this hero talent for both Blood and Frost. However, we are talking about a tank hero talent, so we also have to look in here about what possible defensives are available for a tank, for example. And this one is extremely good for Blood, because one of the weaknesses, the biggest weakness of Blood DK, is taking too much damage at high keys to the point where you get one shot. One of the biggest issues is physical damage, melee hits of enemies in very high fortified keys, for example. In this tree, you have Shattering Soul, which is going to reduce the physical damage taken by 10 seconds for 5% whenever the Reaper Marks explodes. And more importantly, you have Rune Carved Plates, which is at the moment very, very powerful because it's going to translate to an almost permanent 10% magical damage taken reduction and physical damage taken reduction. So 10% DR plus an extra 5% physical DR is a very good set of tankiness for Blood in this tree. Obviously for Frost DK this will be mostly good or not based on the damage of this ability, but for Blood it's already a pretty good set just for the survivability given to you by these talents. The third in line is the second type of hero talents for Demon Hunter, the one for Havoc and Vengeance, not to be confused with the one for Vengeance and Havoc. This is, it's again about glaives, about throw glaives, which has been, reworked in the latest rework of the class as a much more integral part of your rotation, especially for Havoc, who is now playing much more around glaives. Now, similar to the DK one we just mentioned, it does also have a pretty good feedback loop of satisfaction when you play with this art of the glaive. You have the preparation of consuming your souls, and then once you consume your souls, you empower your next two abilities, Chaos Strike and Blade Dance for Havoc, and then Fracture or Shear and Soul Cleave for Vengeance to do more damage. And then once you consume those empowered abilities, the target takes 15% more damage, further pushing Havoc down the line of Inertia, one of the newer talents put in the rework. Inertia itself increases the damage of the target by 18% for 5 seconds. This one now increases the damage of the target by 15% for 5 seconds. So, perhaps we must start to be a little bit too crowded in the amount of specific global cooldowns Havoc has to use properly to line up all the damage increases from their talents and from their rotation to make all of this work with this new talent, Art of the Glaive. Don't forget that on top of consuming the two abilities and gaining 15% more damage, you also get to gain 15% more attack speed for 5 seconds and an empowered next ability, dealing 30% more damage. So it becomes quite technical. We now live in a bizarro world where actually the prep of a Havoc Demon Hunter to do max damage in his Inertia window is one of the more technical and complex out of all of the DPS. That's right. A Havoc Demon Hunter is gonna do that. That's the world we live in right now. Talking about Vengeance, the important part here also becomes looking at the amount of tankiness available in these talents. And it's not much. There isn't nearly as much of, as we mentioned for Blood DK, for example, a high amount of flat damage reduction, for example, available. You do have Army Unto Oneself, which is going to be 10% physical damage taken reduction and whenever you Fellblade, which can also be helped by taking Unhindered Assault to have Vengeful Retreat reset the cooldown of Fellblade. So you can keep up a reasonable uptime of 10% physical damage reduction for Vengeance. That's the main source of damage reduction, of tankiness you can find in this tree. It's still an overall much better talent setup that we have seen yesterday from the more disappointing one. It does have a cool loop around Art of the Glaive, if perhaps making it slightly too complex and crowded in the amount of buttons you have to now press as a Havoc Demon Hunter in the correct order to maximize the damage increase of this ability together with your already existing rotation. the last of the it's good but not amazing hero talent trees goes to Mage. This is the spell slinger between Arcane and Frost. Now, Mage started out pretty strong in the hero talent trees. We got the Frostfire talent tree, which was very cool. And this one is definitely more streamlined compared to the Frostfire version. It still does have a pretty satisfying feedback loop, like we mentioned for Demon Hunter and their Trogglaive damage empowerment loop window and the Mark of the DK, pretty satisfying to pull off. This is somewhat similar, playing around the splinters now spawning whenever you consume Nether Precision for Arcane or Winter's Chill for Frost Mage. The splinter that you conjure yourself are still going to be rather passive, as in they will just be generated by your abilities and then fired off automatically with the final ability, Splinter Storm. So you have abilities conjuring these splinters, and then you have extra effects like the first 8 times an enemy is damaged by Arcane Orb or Frozen Orb, you can conjure a Splinter, casting your cooldown, Arcane Surge or Icy Veins, instantly giving you 8 splinters. You have also Shifting Power, instantly giving you 8 splinters. You have perhaps an extra buff to track with an ending proficiency, getting you a stacking damage to Supernova or Ice Nova, upwards of 180% more damage to Ice Nova, or upwards of a whooping 540% more damage done to Supernova if you let these splinters stack up, with the final barrage, with the Splinter Storm dealing all the damage at once. Now, what's unique about this is that the effect of the Splinter Storm itself, at the very least from the tooltips, mention it being single target, which is interesting because you have all of the other talents having some sort of effect in AoE. Shifting Power is an AoE ability. You have this one proccing from Arcane Orb or Frozen Orb, which are AoE. This one buffs your Supernova or Ice Nova, which are AoE. You have this one coming off of Nether Tempest, for example, which is an AoE ability, and it does splash damage to nearby enemies. This one, Spell Frost Teaching, gives your splinters a 5% chance to summon an Arcane Echo or an Icy Comet that deal AoE damage. So all these previous talents have some sort of either AoE splash damage component or are attached to an AoE ability of Mage. And then the final one, Splinter Storm, actually channels all of those splinters to a single target, which is an interesting cycle, an interesting difference of damage profile, perhaps even better when it comes to funneling, when it comes to doing more damage in AoE to gain more benefits on a single target damage profile, like the finisher of this hero talent, Splinter Storm. It is, as mentioned, way more passive and streamlined, so you don't have to micromanage too many of these features. It's mostly gonna be spawning splinters passively. You will have to keep track, as mentioned, of a few things. If you're playing with Unerring Proficiency, the stack up damage increase of one of your abilities, remembering / realizing that you get a big bump of splinters whenever you use your spec specific cooldown or your class specific cooldown. But for the most part, it's going to be a passive source of damage for both specs. But it's still a nicely developed type of passive damage. It's not nearly as boring and passive, for example, as the Pack Leader Beast Mastery Survival version of passive damage, or even the one for elemental damage in the hero talent trees. This one is definitely more engaging than the other hero talents we have seen yesterday, for example. Not too much, which is a good thing when it comes to extra defensiveness and extra tankiness when it comes to a mage, given that they have already a lot. Yes, technically speaking, you still get to have a free 5% damage DR added to your mirror image on top of an extra clone, so it's even more damage reduction from multiple mirror images on top of having your displacement of Alter Time spawn another mirror image for more damage reduction. So, perhaps this was not needed to make Mage even tankier, but besides that, the tree as a whole is pretty nice. It is pretty flavorful. It does have a cool effect, a cool feedback loop around stacking up all of your splinters and then finishing them off with a big storm. It's not nearly as interactive as the Mark of a DK and the Trogglaive empowerment of a Demon Hunter, but it is still quite satisfying. So these are the 4 talent trees we are putting in the middle of the pack for being pretty good, perhaps missing some things here and there, but overall being a being a successful first iteration of these hero talents. We are mentioning the first iteration because, of course, in the months to come, before the actual release of the expansion, many of these features will end up being changed, reworked, buffed, or nerfed. So, at the very least, the first take of these 4 hero talents are quite positive. So, with this out of the way, I am now going to leave you to the rest of your Sunday. We are starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, the video is over, so we can open the window again. As usual, chirping birds non-stop.